Hello again, Telltale Books. I'm Greg.
I'm Emily.
And we're here to do an interesting topic from, well, it started out at the very beginnings of science fiction and continues to this day, and that is authors who speculate about the extremely far future. I mean, hundreds of thousands or even millions of years in the future. So a lot of great books have covered that topic.
Yes.
And I've read, well, some of course, I've been reading these things throughout my reading life, but there are a couple in particular that I've recently read that I wanted to talk about, and that's what brought up the topic. So the starting point for this subject is, of course, the starting point for all science
Yay!
fiction. The Time Machine by H.G. Wells.
That's a beautiful copy, by the way.
Yeah, it's nice. This is Rockport Publishing.
Ooh.
They do these and they're not very expensive.
Yeah.
These nicely illustrated and nice typography.
Nice typography, yes.
To their books. And I got a hold of this. I think I paid $10 for this.
That's awesome. Oh my goodness. That's beautiful.
And it's a very beautiful book, yes. Little too steampunk. I'm getting kind of tired of gears and clocks for the Time Machine.
My heart. No. Yeah, it is a little overdone for the Time Machine. A lot of people go that route instead.
But the cover, this is all embossed, foil stamped. It's beautiful.
Ooh, it is beautiful.
Very high production value
that.
for a book that didn't set me back much. And it's a nice addition to my collection.
Very pretty. I like the back even too. Even the back is pretty.
Yeah. Hourglass.
Little hourglass look there. I like that.
Okay.
Very pretty.
Something cliche. Anyway, of course, probably everybody knows. If you don't, I'll try not to totally spoil it for you. The Time Machine starts in Victorian England, and with a guy that invents a machine that takes him into the future to 801-702 AD, where he meets the Eloi and the Morlocks. But after that, when he escapes, the Morlocks are after him, and he gets on his machine and he just hits the lever, and it just goes crazy. And when he slows down, the clock on it isn't even really able to count anymore. He's so far in the future. And the sun has become cold and swollen and huge, and there aren't any people on the earth. There aren't any cities. There's just these weird creatures coming out of the ocean at him.
Interesting.
And that was the very, of course, Wells was writing the Time Machine to write about ideas about where evolution might go. He was studying with T.H. Huxley at the time, and of course was learning a lot about biology and evolutionary theory, and he was looking at his social conditions and extrapolating what the future might hold. And so he let his imagination go crazy.
Yeah, that's super fun though.
And he just went way, way, way far into the future. But you have to, in order to have somebody witness real evolutionary change along the lines of what Darwin was talking about. It takes millions of years to see any real changes in evolution of larger organisms. So his character had to be propelled way into the future in order to witness this stuff. And that's the only reason Wells came up with the idea of a time machine, is to get his character to that future.
Yeah, so he could be the bear witness to that evolutionary process. Yes.
So that, of course, if you don't really pay much attention to Jules Verne, that's really the first true science fiction story. And that one just took science fiction to its highest levels. Even Wells, I don't feel, ever quite reached the level of imagination, the level of scientific imagination that he put into that book. So he set the stage for science fiction.
Yeah, he really
the Time Machine.
Put that out there.
And other authors ran with that. One of them that I've recently, been rereading is John W. Campbell, he wrote a couple stories in the 1930s. One's called Twilight and one's called Night, both of which do kind of the same thing, except no time machine. He sets the story from the standpoint of somebody living in that time, not somebody traveling to that time.
Yeah.
But he's kind of like going to the end of the world and the last person on Earth and witnessing what is there.
Yeah.
In one of the stories, it's been a little bit, so I'm getting them mixed up.
That's all right.
Check my trusty iPad, see if I
Your
put
notes.
proper notes in to refresh my memory. In one of the stories, he speculates on and of course I don't.
Oh no.
He speculates on a world where everybody is dead, but all the machines are still running.
Oh, so it's very Wall-E.
Well, kind
yes.
of, except they're
But
not
no.
robot machines. They're not intelligent machines. They're just standard mindless machines that have been...
So, like, the car building facility is still building cars, but there's no
the cars are
humans
still
to stop
there.
anything.
The stoves are still running. The factories are still churning out product, but there's nobody to take advantage of all of it. But the machines were built so well...
They just kept going.
Self-maintaining that they just keep going indefinitely into the far future when nobody is alive anymore.
Yeah. We got a little kitty who's trying to decide if she wants to join us or go to the window.
Now she wants to see out the window, trying to get up there without... There's things in the way on the floor.
She's being cute. But yeah.
Brand new kitty.
Yeah, brand new kitty for
Camera
me.
shy, though.
She's enjoying the birds and snowflakes outside right now.
Yeah, April 18th,
and
it's snowing. Thanks, Wisconsin.
There we go. Typical Wisconsin spring. But yeah.
So then the companion story, Night, by Campbell, is kind of similar, except it's even further in the future, and everything's gone, and the atmosphere is frozen, and the sun is swollen and red, and kind of like the end of the time machine. And, so Campbell basically ran with Wells's idea and just took it in a little different direction. Another story from back then that I don't happen to have in a book with me, by Fritz Lieber, is called A Pail of Air.
Oh.
And that's in the far future, where again the sun has cooled and swollen, and the atmosphere has fallen to the ground as snow.
Oh, interesting.
And there are people still living.
Wow.
So that their houses have to be airtight. And to replenish the oxygen, they have to go out and get a bucket of snow and bring it in. And melt the oxygen to provide air to breathe in this kind of environment.
To kind of have like this biodome, basically.
Well, they're still living in individual houses. Not exactly sure. In the 1940s, a lot of times people didn't really think about how cities and living conditions would change in the future. So you get a lot of them where it's basically the 1940s.
They just
but in the
taped
far
up all
future,
the seams of the house.
Houses and cities and cars all seem to be the same, which is a little bit lack of imagination, but it's still a brilliant story, a very powerful short story.
Yeah.
Of course, another one that we read and reviewed on the channel here, The House on the Borderland.
Yes, House on the Borderland. That was a really good one.
A brilliant one that predates John Campbell and Fritz Lieber. That was written in early 1900s, I think 1904, if I'm remembering right.
Yeah.
And that's in the far future, it takes the character into the far future, where he's seeing the swollen sun and the end of the world.
He kind of has this out-of-body experience where he ends up seeing, that future where what happens to Earth after humans and when the suns explode and stars collide and all kinds of cool stuff. I like that part. So
it's kind of an odyssey where a character takes a trip to where he sees the extremely distant future, similar to Time Machine. And another book that does very much that same sort of out-of-body experience
The Odyssey
is And, of course, the movie, 2001: A Space Odyssey.
I can't wait to read 3000.
3001, yep.
Yep.
That's coming up very soon.
Yes. We've gotten through. That's been a really interesting series.
It has. But
a lot of real science to it.
2001, now 2010 and 2061 didn't really go into the far future. 2001 took us into this imagined far distant encounter with the aliens that were manipulating everything behind the scenes through the monoliths.
Yeah.
And it took one man into that world, but what he was given was this vision of where life will end and what life will grow into. The ultimate
the cycles.
Yeah, the ultimate course of evolution of life into a star child. And so it's kind of, it wasn't exactly far future, but it's kind of speculating about far future.
Yeah, and it kind of leads into a further future as things go on. It's not starting in a very distant future, but it does lead into it throughout the series.
Right.
Which is really, really interesting. Some fun stuff in there.
Now, some other science fiction novels have taken a little different tack on that, to go into the far future but still maintain some connection to our world and who we are. One of the earliest is Foundation, the Foundation trilogy by Isaac Asimov, that takes place in a future, not exactly sure how far in the future, but they don't remember where Earth was. They know that they came from Earth, but they have no clue where it is.
They can't remember where it is. That's so interesting, because I was just talking over the weekend with family, like the idea of lost cities. How do these huge metropolitan, historically significant cities suddenly just go missing? Like, they keep rediscovering these cities that used to be there. It's like, who lost them? How did we lose track of that? And now we've lost a whole planet! I just think it's really funny. I like that idea, though. The concept's interesting.
Losing stuff like that to time, it's kind of like, where I come from, there's a park called Petrifying Springs. It used to be a whole resort.
Oh.
Because it's natural spring water. And it's really good, pure water. But, of course, in the past, people thought it had, like the baths in Bath, England, it supposedly had
all these minerals and good things for you.
Powers of restoring your health and stuff. I don't know anything about that, but the resort was there, but there's very little of it existing. If you go for hikes into the woods, you'll find like stone walls in weird spots, all totally overgrown.
Oh, interesting.
So there is remnants of what it once was. Well, kind of like here in Two Rivers, the Lighthouse Inn. There's just the bare remnants of what that place was supposed to be a long time ago. It was supposed to be a big fancy resort, and it never quite got there. And now it's just a little ruins on the beach near the hotel.
Yeah.
There's another place down in, what is it? Near Elkhart Lake in Wisconsin. There's another place that's a lot like Petrifying Springs, which now it's a fish hatchery.
Oh.
And there some of the buildings do still stand, but they're really wrecks. You go there now, it doesn't look like this place was an expensive resort.
Yeah, you can't tell.
But
from
at
the way
one
it looks
time
now.
it was. At one time, it's not too far from Lake Geneva, and at one time rich people would go there. And it was natural spring waters that supposedly had restorative powers. And so people would go there and
and then over time they just
bathe.
Fall off the face of the earth. Only in this case, they don't know where the earth even is to fall off of.
Right.
Interesting.
Though a lot of your Mayan and Aztec civilization is mostly buried underground now.
Yes.
We know it was
or
there.
Jungle.
But there's still cities that they uncover that they only had knowledge of through stories. Now, it was only, in the 1500s that the Spanish went in and destroyed all those places. 500 years, and
Yeah.
now it's totally overgrown with jungle.
Yeah.
And you have to use
So
imaging
much
from space
yeah.
to try and find what's left
So
of
much
these cities that
technology
were
is
there.
going into refinding these and exposing more of civilizations. Like, I watched this really cool documentary on National Geographic where this guy goes in and he just uses all kinds of technology, laser technology and all kinds of other imaging and things like that, and basically finds the rest of or brand new civilizations that tribes knew were there, like the ancient tribes and stuff, and remnants of the people that once lived there are still around and they still know like approximately where it is, but just finding the sheer scale of it. It's just so funny that I was talking about that this weekend, though, and then it comes up on a planetary scale. I'm like, how do you just lose these significant points in history? But I guess it's kind of a slow death where everybody just eventually forgets.
Yeah, because it becomes unimportant. And, I mean, at some point, technology may cause the planet's resources to be stripped out to the point where we pretty much have to abandon it.
Yeah, and there's nothing more
to do. Or maybe
it
becomes, I've read stories where it becomes all polluted and so people leave it behind.
Yeah.
And go off into space to other worlds. So things like that can happen. And especially when you're talking about books like Foundation, another one, Dune, that's another one that the people there originated from Earth, but they really don't ever mention it.
Yes.
It's so far in the future and Earth is so lost in the past that it's not even part of the story anymore.
Yeah.
So there again, you have this whole civilization far in the future that originated on Earth.
Yeah.
But Earth has been forgotten.
Yes.
Another one kind of along that same theme is Gideon the Ninth and Harold the Ninth.
Yes.
Where the author probably, Tamsin Muir, she probably did that just so she could create a fantasy world that had some plausibility. So she invokes Clarke's Law, that any sufficiently advanced technology will be indistinguishable from magic. And so she can write a story where you have these neuromancers reanimating skeletons and stuff. And in this world where there is some technology, there are some space shuttlecrafts flying around.
Yeah.
But Earth, again, is completely forgotten.
Yeah.
I don't think it's even mentioned. Yeah,
there are items from the past that you kind of pick up pieces of, like Gideon's sunglasses.
Yeah. And they had that room in the bottom of the castle in the first book where there were some artifacts from the distant
old
past.
Maps and things of worlds that no longer exist and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
And that again draws from the Time Machine, where the time traveler finds a museum where there are artifacts from the past.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yes. Good stuff.
Yeah. So, this is a very common one. And then one that I recently read by an author. He mostly writes horror, I think. But this one is science fiction.
Yeah.
It's just a novella, pretty short.
It's a baby book.
And not available in hardcover.
Oh,
it's
bummer.
Only paperback and ebook. But it again is a very good story about a person who is at the very end of the world. And it's a complicated one. I really got to read it again because it's such a strange novel. But I loved it.
Yeah.
But it's already faded in my memory enough that I can't really give you a proper synopsis of what's going on.
Yeah.
But it messes
worth a
with
refresher.
It messes with the identity. I mean, this is supposed to be the last person, but there's another person. So there's issues of identity and issues of just what is a human being.
Yeah. We kind of run into that same thing in the Purple Cloud we've done a video of in the past, where you have this last man on Earth sort of thing.
Yeah. And the only difference with that is it wasn't in the far future.
Yeah, that was what I was going to say. For its time, it was happening in the present of when it was written. But it's still... It's so interesting. One of the consistencies I'm seeing most of the time in these far futures is that they're kind of dystopian. It's like people think that the world is worse off without humans. When I am very interested to see someone who challenges that. I would like to see a story where someone challenges it and says the world's actually better off. Like there's this whole, I don't know,
society.
Yeah, like there's, nature thrives more, and it just become, maybe it's kind of goes along with that concept of those creatures, the new evolution, watching this new species come to life and build civilizations, and what it becomes and what it does would be far more interesting, I think, than just assuming that after humans everything's going to be this desolate wasteland of nothing because we're not here to take care of it, when in actuality we're probably the ones who destroyed it anyway. But it's interesting to see people. Humans are so self-righteous, we just assume that everything's gonna fall apart when we're gone. And I just think it's an interesting concept that we think so highly of ourselves that in the far future, if we're not there, everything else falls apart too. And I don't know that would be true at all.
Yeah, for
an interesting story, I could see it be being boring, where it's like the trees decide to become Ents or something. Like, I don't know, where it's all this peace and love and happiness. There's no conflict to be interesting. But at the same time, I'd be really interested to see someone build that future.
That somehow would make an interesting story. And I think you don't see it mainly because we are people, and so we always write from our point of view, And so, what authors try to imagine in these books is, what is the world going to be like when our world is is like Aztec civilization, totally wiped out and gone and dust, and nobody remembers any of us.
Yeah.
We know it'll happen if enough time goes by. And will there be humans? We don't know. Maybe there will be. Maybe it'll be where we're off planet. Maybe it'll be where the planet is dying. Maybe it'll be one that I neglected to mention, The Book of the New Earth by, Earth of the New Sun. I forget the title of this series. Claw and the Conciliator by Gene Wolfe, and the books that followed that. I haven't read those. I've got a copy finally, and I need to read them, but those are definite classics, but that's one where civilization has broken down. Human beings are still around, but it's in the far future on Earth, but Earth bears no resemblance to our world. And, so everybody does
kind of like that Planet of the Apes thing, where they think they're on another planet only to find out.
Well, and that's another one I forgot about. Planet of the Apes does that too, where they go into the far future and humans are wiped out and the apes have taken over.
Yep.
Of course,
the evolutionary process started over again.
Did that to try and make a satirical commentary about racism, but it's just a good example of how this trope in science fiction can be used to imagine anything and say anything you want by creating a world that is so totally different from ours.
And I think too, like, I didn't read a lot of far future books growing up as, like, in this context. Most of the sci-fi I read was like Scott Westerfeld's Uglies and Pretties series. Or like I read The Hunger Games and that kind of stuff, where it's still very human propelled, but it's like at the cusp of the fall of civilization or like the cusp of some kind of revolution. I didn't read a lot of stories where we had like the scientific basically process of going into the next evolution, but they were still these far distant futures where people recognized, or like the Divergent series, where people recognize, like, hey, this used to be the United States, now it's Area 13 or whatever, you know what I mean? So
I think what most writers use it for is a way to create a plausible fantasy world. Once you get,
it's a foundation for the familiar to build new things off of.
Once you get to 801702 AD, you don't have to have any connection to our world today. You can build whatever world you want there and just make it as crazy or as wild or as fantastic. You can, turn it into sword and sorcery. You can have magic that works. You can have creatures that never existed, and just go mad with your imagination.
Yeah.
Which, that's what you see in Gideon and Harrow, and it's what you see in Dune.
Yeah.
And it's what you see in H.G. Wells, and it's what you see in The Warren, too. The Warren is, I feel, a lot more connected to the John Campbell Twilight and Night stories.
Yes.
Having that where there's still remnants of our civilization, but there's only one person left.
Yeah, you're just kind of scratching at the surface.
Yeah, to witness, and the world is pretty much over.
Isn't... Well, no. That one... Nightfall, that's not really distant future, as in is probably
Isaac
different.
Asimov?
Yeah, different planet.
Yeah, it's supposed to be, although that's one of the weaknesses of Nightfall, is that it feels too much like Earth.
Yeah.
In the way Asimov wrote it. But it's supposed to be on some distant planet. And here again, it's never exactly said, but everybody speculates that it must be in a globular cluster where there are a lot of stars really close together. In order to create that environment, it's a planet set there, and
yes.
Asimov asks the question: what would the people be like? How would they react?
And even then, though, it's still a distant future story because there's remnants and allusions to this of having happened before, to that event having happened before.
Yeah, but it's kind of like Star Wars. Is it the future or is it a long time ago?
Yeah, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. We don't know.
Because it's a completely different planet. It could be on a planet that is already dust for some reason to us today.
Yeah.
Asimov never sets that context.
Yeah. Which kind of gives you a lot to play with in the imagination. But still, it's like, I want answers. But yeah.
Sometimes you don't get them.
Yeah.
Sometimes
I just think it's so interesting, too, how many different far future types of stories there are. Even though, like, you've mentioned a lot of the foundations of how the far future story started, we are seeing such a change from, like, that a lot of those were rooted in the science of the future. Whereas we're seeing this adjustment towards the social situations of the future and the political climate that my generation is starting to notice, and that's the kind of literature I grew up with. So one of the things I'm noticing, based off of what you've read and what I've read in, like, distant future science fiction, is that there's this huge dynamic between focusing on the science and the object and the Earth itself and what evolutionary processes are doing and things like that, versus now we have things like Pretties or, like, Divergent, Hunger Games, where they're distant future, definitely set in, on Earth. But it's more about a social or political dynamic.
Yeah.
Where it's less about the science and more about the revolution or the social changes that have occurred because of the way the future is. Even, like, when you think about, like, Soylent Green, even, is about very much about that. What I can't remember the original name of the short story.
Make Room.
Make Room. Yep, the novel that eventually made Soylent Green the movie. So just watching that social dynamic change, though, where it's not about the science anymore, because, like, we were talking about Ringworld with Larry Niven's work, where he spews all of this actual, like, theory and scientific law and all this other stuff throughout his work, where it's based in actual science, and now we're seeing this switch to just social dynamic. And I just think it's so interesting to see that. I don't know if it's because of the introduction of social media that our world is becoming bigger to us, so we're starting to write even futuristic stuff based off of how much bigger our world is getting based on the individual's interaction with it, just because of social media and whatever. But you were saying something earlier too about it's because a lot of the early science fiction was written by actual scientists.
Yeah, they were kids that read things like John Campbell's Twilight in the 1930s, and they were inspired by that to want to go into science, and a lot of them did become scientists or engineers. They got PhDs, they were professors, they were working for Bell Laboratories or places like that, and writing science fiction on the side. And So they were scientists first, and they really weren't writers. They didn't spend their whole time trying to hone the craft of writing. They came up with these cool ideas, and they wrote stories for it. And the ideas were always hinged on whatever scientific facts.
Yeah, there's always
or
like a
theories
practical application.
that were interesting them at that time. So it was very hard science driven. And since the 1970s, and I think Larry Niven kind of stands at the end of the whole really hard science, where, I mean, people have done calculations about Ringworld and
its plausibility.
how many planets would have to be destroyed to make it, what exactly are the stresses on the whole thing. I mean, down to
how the atmosphere builds itself.
Down to the mathematical equations of, if we had the money and had the resources, we already have the math and science to build the damn thing.
Yeah.
Because of all the fans that have sat down and
actually worked
gone beyond Larry Niven and worked all this stuff out. And that the fans include people like Freeman Dyson that Niven based his whole idea on. During the 1970s started to go away, and you started to see fewer scientist writers involved in science fiction. And so today, most of the science fiction today most of what's being published is fantasy, straight out. It's not science fiction.
Yeah, it's not true science fiction.
And a lot of it just isn't. It's like The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. That's not science fiction at all. And the science fiction that is being published, a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it, is not being written by people who really have a scientific background. They're writers first. Yeah. And they may do research to get some things right, but they are not engineers. They are not writing equations to make sure their planet is capable of existing. Arthur C. Clarke in The Fountains of Paradise wrote about building an elevator to space, which sounds like this totally ridiculous thing, but he talked to the people and he worked out the math, and it can be
done. Yes.
It can actually be built and work. Today's writers aren't going to that level of scientific accuracy because, frankly, they don't have the scientific background.
Yeah. And science is we've even talked about this before, that science is so much more than what it used to be. There's been so much discovered in such a short amount of time as technology has developed. The average human mind can't really fathom everything. Unless you are a scientist, there's so many specializations within science. Without the others, there's no way to fathom all of it.
Right.
It's just too complex.
Yeah, it's gone way too far for one person to really understand all of it. And, without spending their whole lifetime devoted to it, you just don't have time to be writing novels, too. So Larry Niven, Gregory Benford is another one. He's an astrophysicist. Yeah. And he writes science fiction and fantasy. Yeah.
The Andromeda, A for Andromeda.
Yeah, that's Fred Hoyle. He was the president of the Royal Astronomical Society for most of his life. Yeah. So he was on the cutting edge of astronomy for his entire career, and he wrote science fiction too. Yep. So back then you had that. Yeah. Today you don't have that. There might be a couple of writers out there that have that level of scientific knowledge, but most of what's being written today doesn't have that, and so
most of them are writing dissertations and essays and scientific journals. Where do they find time to write fiction?
Yeah. So today's writers, I don't think, not to put them down. They're writing great stories, which is the whole point.
Yes, but it hinges a lot on plausible deniability.
Yeah, they just don't have the mathematical chops to be able to write hard science fiction with how complicated our knowledge is today. Yeah. It's not like the 1930s where all you had to do was understand chemical rocket propulsion that Goddard was working on, and you could talk about going into space. Yeah. The space program is far more complicated than that today. So, rocket ship Galileo couldn't be written today.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, that's what I may be wrong, but that's my perception of what has happened, why science fiction today is a lot less science-based.
It is more social. I think it's just because our world is getting bigger for us. With the increases in technology, we're seeing more, we're learning more, we're knowing more about what's happening internationally. We are learning more about what's happening in our solar system because it can be communicated faster and better. So I think the social change, like this change to a more social dynamic storyline, is natural. But I do agree. I think to some extent we're working our scientists so hard they can't become fiction writers if they want to.
Well, and the audience on the other side too. The audience isn't advanced enough with science and math to be able to understand it. So you have the hard science fiction novels that are being written. Reviewers are putting disclaimers on, like, you know, you may not be able to deal with the level of science in this, kind of like people reviewing erotic fiction.
Yes, you may not be able to deal with how much fetishism is in here. Yeah, or
you know,
whatever.
so it's kind of on that level now. It's when you get a writer that does take it.
This is very spicy science.
This may be too intense for you.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
It's got algorithms in it.
Yeah, they're talking scientific theories and name dropping. Like, we should know what's going on. But I think, too, like, a lot of the authors in previous work were really good at explaining like, there were a lot of things that I've read with you, like 2001: A Space Odyssey, that series. A lot of those theories and things were very well explained in layman's terms. Probably not as thoroughly as they could be, but the basics of it have been explained well, where I don't feel like I was left in the dark by anything that was written. And that's just the key of good writing, I think, is that these people with scientific brains were able to put things in layman's terms and still make it interesting. And I don't know that the science doesn't seem to match up with that anymore, where you can't just put things in layman's terms anymore.
Not really.
Not without making huge sweeping generalizations that, you know, have a lot of nuance and circumstances and gray areas and, you know, too many variables, too many factors that could go into it. So I think the change into a more social dynamic, futuristic, you know, dystopian, very far future storylines, I feel like that was a natural segue. Is now it's less about the science and more about how it's affecting people and how it's affecting politics and how it's affecting economies and commerce, because that's a huge part. Because I think one of the things that we have to remember as humans is that because we are relational beings, all of our education is so interconnected. Like, we use the arts to express science and math visually. We use math to, you know, words to express math and science and communicate it. Like, it's all so interconnected that it's really difficult to forego one without the other.
Yeah.
And a lot of people want to put separations between them, but they all kind of need each other to communicate each other.
Another dynamic driving that whole change is that in the 1930s, people looked at science in the future as it was going to be, you know, the flying cars, and everything was going to be perfectly clean, and
we'll solve all these problems.
All kinds of time on their hands, and there weren't going to be any problems. In the 60s and 70s, we started to see the dark side of technology, how we were getting pollution, how we were becoming overpopulated, how chemicals in our foods were not so good for us, how we saw 3 Mile Island and the one in Russia, Chernobyl, where we had these horrible disasters that could have or did kill lots of people because we didn't do our due diligence to protect our society from the technology, from the science.
And a lot of the time, too, it was a lack of understanding of the science. Watch the miniseries Chernobyl, by the way.
Well, or
real good.
Or corporate greed. What's the town in New York where there was this corporation dumping chemicals.
Oh.
And it got into the groundwater, and everybody was dying. And this one researcher, I think her first name was Karen, or Doctor or something, she fought really hard. I think she was even killed.
Yeah, she ended up being mysteriously murdered. I remember this story, but I can't remember this town it was.
It had a funky name,
Yeah.
and now it won't come to me.
I don't
But
know.
that was an example of that really opened everybody's eyes that corporations were willing to just kill people and sweep it under the carpet
For the sake of commerce.
Well, just because they didn't want to spend the money to clean up their own mess.
Yeah.
They thought they could just dump it in the local river and be done with it and not give a damn.
And thus dystopian literature.
Yeah. And when people pointed that out, they said, oh, no, we're not doing that. And they totally covered it up. And they went so far as to kill people to keep it covered up, to protect themselves and just continue watching people die of cancer.
Yep.
Which boggles the mind that people could have, that anybody in business even would have that complete lack of empathy. I mean, that's the kind of behavior that you see with serial killers and psychopaths
and dictators.
Yes,
because I can't remember which dictator it was. Maybe it was Hitler or Stalin. I can't remember, but somebody said, "One death is a tragedy, 1,000 is a statistic." And that's literally how they felt. It's like, somebody close to me can be a tragedy, but 1,000 is just a statistic.
Well, it comes from class structure. People that see themselves in the upper classes, which today is the people with money, the people that have less, they're not people. They're not as important.
They're the ones.
And so they justify their bad actions by saying, well, they're just, they're homeless.
Or they knew what they were getting into.
Yeah.
They knew there's a potential risk for that.
That's a big workers.
Yeah, that's a big one. They knew. And it's like, yeah, but who actually sits and reads the fine print?
Yeah. So yeah, that caused a big change where people stopped trusting technology and stopped trusting science and gave up this idea that there was going to be this beautiful, clean future with all this high technology making all of our lives perfect. So the science fiction of the 1940s couldn't happen today because none of us trusts it.
Yeah, none of us have that idealism
We're all
that
thinking,
the future is going to be improvements.
It's not going to be like that. So, the stories are a lot more social and a lot more focused on people.
Yes.
Which is probably a good thing.
Yeah. I think we need to use fiction to make social commentary and to make political commentary. I think that's an important thing to do. And I feel like science fiction and fantasy leave a good platform for that because you can do more extremes. And extremes that you really can't get away with in our modern world because we have too many, especially in the United States. We have the checks and balances systems. We have Minutemen. We have, we have all these other factors that play into our political climate that can cause revolution and things like that. Other countries have the same thing. So there's a lot of ways of getting around it in a more, I guess, if you want to go for a more realistic. But I feel like fantasy and science fiction really get a good platform to make a lot of bolder and more sweeping statements just because the situations can be far more than what we're used to.
And that's why there's so much of it that gets kicked out of libraries, too.
Yeah. They're like,
banned books.
You've been banned now.
Because you're talking about a future that we don't want to believe in.
Yeah.
So we should probably cut this short before it gets to a whole hour.
That's all right. We can make this a two-parter if we need to.
It's a big subject. It covers a lot of science fiction, but it's my favorite. I love far future stories.
And the social changes and dynamics of the change over the years. It's just so interesting to talk about and to have witnessed. Especially if you're a person who really loves like classic stuff and contemporary things. Being able to read the full spectrum. It's really worthwhile, so... Tell us also what some of your favorites are. Leave them in the comments. Let us know.
I'm sure we missed some good ones.
Yeah, we would absolutely love to read some if we're not familiar. So go ahead and let us know some of your favorites. And that's all I got to say.
That's all I got.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.